My name is Javier Lopez of the left-handed Limaçon, and today I'll be showing you how I built this tessellated watercolor box. I decided to make this case for my friend Chloe, a talented artist whose work you can check out through the link in the description. This design is essentially a remix inspired by a box built by Mateusz Urbanowicz, another great watercolor artist. I designed the box to hold 3 rows of 4 paints as well as some paintbrushes. The design also includes a sleek fold-out foot that allows you to raise the box to a more comfortable angle. I also chose to include these metal trays that make it really easy to take out paints and change them. For the full info and details, make sure to check out my Instructables article linked below. Now, let's get started. I began by sketching the box in Fusion 360 and printing out drawings with all the dimensions I would need. For this project, you'll need cherry lumber, several thicknesses of plywood, along with safety equipment, hardware, sandpaper, finish, and the standard equipment. To make the frame that makes up the middle layer, I started by cross-cutting some cherry lumber before ripping it, and then cross-cutting once again using the miter gauge on the table saw to get them to the right size. From here, I used the crosscut sled on the table saw to cut dados in the side pieces, which will accept the crossbars later on. Finally, I glued together the frame using plenty of clamps. On the table saw, I cut out several pieces of plywood that will be laminated together to make the final thickness of the lid and the bottom 2 layers. To make the layer with the fold-out foot, I cut the bottom into 4 pieces and made 2 tiny feet. I drilled holes into them to accept 1/8 inch metal dowels. The fold-out foot fits into 2 holes in the bottom layer, which lock it in place but allow it to rotate. The length of the fold-out foot was calculated so that when fully extended, it raises the box to a comfortable 15-degree angle. I made sure to fill any voids in the plywood with wood filler. I used a disc sander at school to make the edges perfectly flat, but if you don't have a disc sander, you can just use the sandpaper with the block. To make geometric veneer patterns, all you really need are some basic tools and some patience. For this project, I chose to use walnut, cherry, and birch veneers. I started off by coming up with a code to remind me what pieces I needed, and then I measured out the dimensions of the box and wrote them down. Using these dimensions, I cut out enough pieces to cover the main body of the box. In order to prevent the plywood edges from soaking up all the glue, I first pre-sealed each edge by spreading glue and letting it dry, before doing the actual glue up. Once each piece was dry, I came back in with a razor knife to trim off the excess, cutting in multiple passes. I'll save the math for the Instructables, but basically, I concluded that I needed 168 trapezoids, about 9mm wide, with one base of 10mm and the other base of 20mm. Too bad I didn't realize the sheer magnitude of this number until about trapezoid 97. After checking that my cuts were accurate, I moved on to cutting several strips out of each kind of wood. To make the cleanest and most accurate cut, it makes sense to cut it in several passes, rather than try to get it all in one go. In order to cut the correct angles on the trapezoids, I made a little 30-60-90 triangle on the table saw, and used it as a template for my X-Acto knife. Cutting all the trapezoids took the good part of 2 hours, but at least I got to catch up on podcasts. In order for the tessellation to properly glue, all of the pieces must be taped together. It starts off with these small triangular units. These units come together to form the final pattern. From here, the triangular units get taped together to make rows, and then the rows get taped together to make the entire pattern. Afterwards, I trimmed the sheet to fit the lid. The great thing about tessellations is that once one side has been cut off, those pieces can be brought over to the other side to complete the rectangle. And with that, the sheet was done, and I was ready to move on to final assembly. I made sure to sand everything really well, first using medium and then fine grit sandpaper. Gluing the pattern to the lid wasn't terribly difficult. I marked the positions of the corners of the pattern and then just spread glue on both surfaces before clamping them together. For the border pieces, I experimented with a stain made of vinegar left to sit with steel wool for a few days. The iron in this solution reacts with the tannins in the wood, and over the course of several hours, the pieces turn a nice dark black or gray. To glue them on, I simply used some more blue painter's tape and put it underneath the clamp setup. Once dry, I came back in with a chisel to get rid of the excess tape and glue squeeze out. To make the pull-out trays, I used an X-Acto knife to score a line just smaller than the width of the rows of the box. For the trays, I used thin aluminum that was easy to cut with tin snips. I used sandpaper to get rid of any burrs. Since I didn't have a specialized metal bending machine, I found it pretty effective to just bend it around a piece of scrap wood. As an extra touch, I rounded the corners to give it a soft feel. These trays will make it very easy to switch out paints. Instead of fiddling with a needle or a file, the user can simply pull up on the tabs and release the trays. Now it was time to finish. I propped the pieces up on screws, driven into a few pieces of scrap wood, and then I sprayed each side with 4 coats of lacquer. This protective coat not only gives it a layer of protection, but it also brings out the natural color of the wood. Before moving on to the final finishing step, I rubbed each piece down with fine steel wool to get rid of any lacquer bumps. A thin coat of finishing wax helps waterproof the piece, as well as give it a nice shine. quick tip for buffing out wax is to put a microfiber cloth inside of a finishing sander. Like this, it's easy to buff out the wax to a nice sheen in no time. Installing the 2 hinges and the clasp was the final step. I just marked and drilled the holes using a hand drill and then screwed in the small screws. The small clasp was done the exact same way, and finally, the box was done.